Hello and welcome back to the Pondering Papaya podcast. What is your race recap of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix? Joining me to discuss the race is Sarah McKenzie-Foley and Alex Harrington. So let's get into it. So joining me now, as promised, is Alex and Sarah. First of all, thank you both for coming on today. Alex, how did you enjoy the race overall?
Yeah, I thought, it was a good race. I think Jeddah as a circuit is fast and high speed. It's varied. The first sector has some good windy bits, and second and third sectors are more about high speed. And, I think because we have that DNF, I think we had some interesting strategies going into the race as well. And then behind Magnussen, we had this incredible kind of almost classic racing behind Magnussen, where it almost reminded me of racing before the cars had DRS. There was a lot of overtaking on the corners. And then we had good racing between the McLarens and the Mercedes, obviously with very opposite setups. And then plus, we saw Ollie Behrman, and it was just brilliant to watch a young driver come in and absolutely just enjoy it and own it. And I think, Red Bull is obviously so far ahead as we expected them to be. But no, I think it's good. After Bahrain and now Saudi, we get a good idea of where the teams are going to be, at least at the beginning of the season before the development war starts. So yeah, I think, it was a good, solid race. Not overly exciting, but a good race.
Yeah, so like Alex says, we've had two races now on two very different circuits. Sort of, what's the pecking order of the top teams in your mind? I know it's quite harsh. It's been two races, but who do you think sort of got a step ahead of everyone else?
I think it's, obviously Red Bull, as Alex said, way out, driving into the sunset. They're separate from everyone, I think. And then Ferrari looked really good. I think obviously poor Carlos Sainz, I don't even know how he got in that car and did any practice. Just to see him walk, that video of him walking back into the paddock yesterday, I don't know how he did it. But anyway, they looked fantastic. Whoever was in the car, I think they're definitely second. And then I think at the moment, it's McLaren in front of Mercedes. I think based on consistency of performance, and certainly on the George Russell side of the house. Obviously, he's had two more kind of consistent performances than Lewis. And then I think Piastri, certainly, obviously he got the kind of the rub of the green with they split the strategies for the safety car. So I think I guess that's a little bit of luck, but you need that in sport. And then I think Lando Norris did the best with what he had. Andrea Stella said afterwards that he could have got a podium, he thought. I'm not sure about that. I'm obviously these are the people that have the data. I can't argue with them on that point, but I would have been surprised to see Lando on the podium, I think, yesterday.
Yeah, let's move on to McLaren. Let's do the race report first of all. So like you mentioned, we'll start with Oscar. So started P6, ended P4. Like Sarah mentioned, he got the rub of the green with the safety car. McLaren were in a difficult spot really because their drivers were very close together, and it meant if they pitted both at the same time, the second one of that was definitely going to have some issues compared to the first one. So Oscar got the nod. He pitted for lap 7, went on to medium, on to hard, and that was pretty much what the whole grid did really. Whereas Lando started P5, ended P8. He didn't pit till lap 37 where he went medium to soft, and it was very much a case of McLaren were desperate for a second safety car really. They sort of gambled there was going to be one, and they were getting to the point where it was just obvious not one was going to come. So yeah, eventually pitted lap 37 onto the softs and finished in P8 in a little bit of battle with Hamilton towards the end. But yeah, if we start with Oscar's, obviously P4, a great end for him, really. What did you make of his race, Alex? Because I think he said beforehand that P4 was pretty much the maximum he could achieve. So it seems like a perfect race for him.
Yeah, I think, like we've said, Ferrari is definitely right now the faster car than the McLaren. But I think Oscar had a great race. He had a really good start. Lando obviously struggled a bit at the start, but Piastri just he dispatched Aston Martin, Alonso very, very quickly before the DRS kicked in. Obviously, McLaren were struggling with their DRS efficiency. So it was very important that he did that very quickly. And I think that really made the race for him, to be honest. And yeah, he was able to just capitalize on a very good qualifying. And let's face it, I think he also capitalized on the loss of Carlos Sainz. I think if Carlos was in the mix, he probably would have been pushed down a place. And yeah, great battle with Lewis. I think probably learned a lot from watching Lewis make his car as wide as possible. But like Lando, he really did struggle with the setup of the car. It was very draggy. I'm not sure whether McLaren just made the wrong setup choice or whether they weren't overly optimistic about their floor efficiency, where they get the majority of the downforce. It's probably the former. I think they did just make a bad choice there. But yeah, for Oscar, it's kind of business as usual. And, it's his second race. It's his second season, sorry, in Formula One now. And he's shown this maturity of a much more seasoned driver. He doesn't put himself in danger. He can really look after his tyres. And I think he was presented a good race and a lucky race because, he pitted first, like you said. And I think he just took what he could from it. So I think Piastri should step away from that race with a big smile on his face.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, as you mentioned there, like he probably went to bed last night and saw that red Ineos rear wing, and he was stuck behind Hamilton. I mean, it was a great bit of driving from Hamilton because obviously he was on the older tyres, the less fresh tyres, and yet he kept Piastri behind him pretty much every time. Like Piastri got ahead, but he went off the track twice, and then Hamilton got this place back. And only when Hamilton pitted was it that Piastri moved ahead. Sarah, do you think if he gets past Hamilton, say after a couple of laps, do you think he could have gone and got Leclerc, or do you think that was just a step too far?
I think it might have been a step too far. I think, I looked at like the fastest lap pace from the end of the race, and this is Leclerc v Norris, but that's just, in comparison Ferrari to McLaren, Leclerc's best lap was 0.3 up on Norris's top lap pace. So I think it probably would have been tricky. Maybe if he had got right within DRS with like 4 or 5 laps left, he could have really put Charles under pressure. And sometimes Charles does, he does struggle under pressure to keep his cool. So it's not that it would have been impossible, but I think as you both said, Piastri has to be really happy with what he achieved yesterday. And I think it's, the big thing, we said this before coming into this season was, okay, he's got great pace. He's very calm and collected, when he needs to be. But his racecraft, his long run racecraft could do with some work. And I think he really showed that yesterday, that he's building that up, which is fantastic to see because he didn't sort of try anything desperate behind Hamilton. It was at the end of the day a defensive masterclass, but he didn't risk anything huge. And I think he really, really could have. He could have got to the point where he's just so frustrated. He's like, I'm going to send it. And he didn't. And I think that was the right thing to do. And that to me is a really positive signal, I think, for him going forward.
Yeah, you're right. There was a lot of race maturity from him. I think he's still maybe the second youngest. Obviously, Ollie Behrman came in, but one of the youngest guys on the grid. And yeah, like I think it's also a good point to point out that we mentioned before, like so one of his faults last year, and there weren't many, were he wasn't great at saving tyres. And I think even Max said after the race in what is essentially the Max Verstappen podcast in that cool down room that second stint was very long. Like even the experienced drivers were struggling with it. So the fact that Piastri was able to do it was very impressive. And so yeah, he's on to 16 points now, up to P5 in the standings. And if we move on to Norris, obviously we mentioned he had the worst of the two strategies. I mean, it had to go one way. Like he did well, pretty much as well as he could. But that second safety car just didn't come, did it, Alex? And that eventually he was going to slip down the order.
Yeah, Lando had generally quite a difficult race. I think, he potentially jumped the start. I'm going to say potentially because I'm being diplomatic. He potentially jumped the start. And I think, it was a sensor issue, but obviously that adds pressure to the start of his race. And then he quickly had Russell on his gearbox. So he had pressure from the Mercedes as well. So I think he started the race on that back foot. And then the strategy call, fair play to McLaren. They did exactly what they should have done. They split their hand. And it means that one of the drivers were going to get a good race at least. But, Lando worked with that. But they simply had too much drag on his car. And like you said, Sarah, the McLarens were slow. Looking at the telemetry, Lando had the slowest car on the grid. And even when he did have DRS, it wasn't overly efficient. So he struggled very much on the first stint. And then safety car came out. And then he struggled keeping the Red Bulls behind him, which, it's like something out of a horror movie, isn't it? When you've got 2 Red Bulls behind you. So I think he did very, very well because what he was presented with was just an impossible task. But what it does show is that McLaren have some very good pace. He was still able to get points out of it. And, maybe it doesn't look like from the results Lando did very well, but I do think he did. I think he was presented a poor race, but he really utilised what he had. But also I think, we've got upgrades on the horizon as well. McLaren, that we know that they can develop a car. So this is very early days. But I mean, so far, the driver pairing is brilliant.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, he did do pretty much as well as possible. And fun fact, he's now one of 2 drivers to have led a lap. I mean, I won't tell you who the other one was because it's fairly obvious. Yeah, so overall, what did we think of making McLaren? Because, I mean, I was speaking on a preview to the pod that I think this was a track that was supposed to suit McLaren. Obviously, it was a very high-speed circuit. And you mentioned there, Alex, that one of their flaws, it seemed, was DRS. And they really had problems sort of, they weren't that kind of Red Bull style car where they just absolutely fly under DRS. So what did you make of the race overall? Do you think McLaren should be happy with what they did, or do you think there was a little bit more on offer?
I do think they should be happy. I think regardless of where the car's performance comes right now, I do feel like they are going to be behind Ferrari. They chose the safe option, like I said, not double stacking the drivers. But looking at the general lap times, they are the 3rd fastest car in the grid, and also the most improved over last year, and that can only be a good thing. Like I said, they desperately struggled with setup and top speed. But maybe without the safety car, they could have. I don't think, like Sarah said, I don't think there was a podium in there for the drivers. But a 4-5 finish, I think that'd be a pretty realistic finish for them. And they're ahead of Mercedes in the standings, and Mercedes is this powerhouse, a proven powerhouse. So I think Zach Brown should be really happy with how he's developing the team. 5 years ago, we would never have thought that they'd be this far up. And, it's a long season. We've got 24 races this season. We're only 2 races down, very different tracks. I think this is a very good standing point for McLaren to start thinking, okay, now we've got the development of 2 very different tracks. They can just learn from that. And we know what their development is like. And, now Norris was saying that his battle was with the Mercedes and Aston Martin before the race. And look, I know Norris was a bit of an anomalous result because of the way the race went, but I think, they're doing brilliant. They're ahead of where they want to be. So I think they can only be proud of that.
Yes, Sarah, if we look towards the season ahead, do we see McLaren sort of being in a rivalry with Mercedes? Like Alex mentioned there, they are ahead at the moment, but do you think McLaren still have ambitions? I mean, pre-season I said that McLaren were getting P2, still back that, but do you think now are we sort of seeing a bit where Red Bull obviously so far ahead, they're clearly the best team. Are Ferrari closer to Red Bull than they are to McLaren, or do you think McLaren can still draw Ferrari in?
That's a good question. I think if you're to go on the massive jumps that they made in development last year, they certainly could get closer to Ferrari. I still think at the moment their battle is with Mercedes. And I think if you look at, because the season is so long, let's say if you look at the first half and the second half, I think for them what would be fantastic is to go, finish the first half of the season strongly ahead of Mercedes on points, both in the drivers and the constructors championship. I think based on what's going on at the moment, I do think that's possible. And I think that they're a momentum team. I think both of their drivers they really benefit from positive momentum. So I think if that's what they can keep building up, certainly they could be ahead of Mercedes, who seem to not understand any of the feedback output that their car is giving them, regardless of whether it's positive or negative. Whereas McLaren, they just seem to have a better grasp of the data that comes out of the car. We don't hear them saying things that Mercedes say, like, oh, we have no idea why it showed up today and it didn't yesterday. They don't seem to have that level of confusion, which you need to be sure on those things in order to positively develop. So I definitely think that they could. I think they're a really, really strong contender against Ferrari. And then I think Mercedes are just sort of they're almost this black box where nobody really knows what's going on. Who knows what's going to show up on the day? So I think McLaren need to capitalize on that, and they just need to be super consistent, which is why weekends like this with a strong points finish are so important.
Yeah, you're right. That Mercedes, I mean, Turtle Wolf and the engineers must be tearing their hair out. They've had a few years of having a semi-quick car, but then they actually have no idea how to get the best out of it. And I think Turtle Wolf said again this weekend that it has a very small window, and I think that was the point of this car, was to sort of make it not have a small window. But obviously, they might improve as the year goes on. But I think you're both right to sort of point out that it's very early in the season. I've got a fact for you that this is the first time McLaren have scored consecutive points in both the races for both drivers since 2021, and that just shows you how long it's been, how traditionally slow starters McLaren are, especially in this era of racing. And I think to be on P3, 28 points after 2 races, I'm pretty sure that, well, obviously that's much better than it was last year. And I'm pretty sure that's a good start as we head into Melbourne in a couple of weeks' time. So if we move away, and obviously it wasn't just F1 on the grid this weekend. F1 Academy began its second season, a much revamped second season, because obviously now we've got all 10 F1 teams have got a driver representative. Red Bull, in fact, have 3 of them. But yeah, every single constructor in the F1 grid is now represented in the F1 Academy, which is very good. Bianca Bustamante is obviously McLaren's star, so she's finished 5th in race 1, 6th in race 2. But I wanted to bring this up because it was obviously great to see them on the track, and also it was great to see it broadcast after the problems they had last year. But there was a bit of a sour taste for a lot of people coming away, because obviously Dorian Pin, who looks like a very strong Mercedes driver, they look like they've got 2 very quick rookies now in their paddock, but she won, but then she got it taken away, a very harsh 20-second penalty for essentially crossing the line twice. I mean, Sarah, what do you think that looks as a sport? And like, do you think something should have been done about it? Because yes, it's in the rules, but I mean, it's not the worst offence in the world, is it?
It's not, but I think if you're going to hold, if your goal is to get a female driver into Formula One and you've got an entire series based on that premise, you've got to hold everyone to the same standards. I think it would have been worse. Like, it would have been worse optics for them to not penalise her, as awful as it was to see it happen. I think you have to apply the rules the same for everyone. To be honest, I'd be quite critical of, I haven't heard the onboard, but I'd be quite critical of the team there. I don't really understand how, she's a driver. She's like, there's so much going on. If you're not sure whether or not she's seen it, or if you're not, if there's any doubt whatsoever, say something. Like I say, I haven't heard the onboard, I don't know, but it just seems a very easy, obvious ball to drop. Like, it felt weird to me that was allowed to happen. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think, a lot of the blame should be on the team. I mean, there's been a few views of what Dorian saw as she was driving the line. The checker flag isn't hugely obvious. Obviously, that's the number one problem, that it should be more obvious. But like you said, she's driven a whole lap at racing speed. I mean, someone in Mercedes probably should have clocked that she's going awfully fast for it in lap. Like, yeah. So I think, Alex, would you agree the blame sort of on the team really? And maybe they should borrow Bono for a weekend and maybe get him in there, because he'll probably know what's going on.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I think when you're racing at that kind of speed, it's Saudi Arabia as well. You've got this tunnel vision, haven't you? You've got to avoid the walls. There's so much going on. There's so much you're thinking about as a racing driver. I'm really surprised that someone didn't just say down the radio, hey, you're in lap now, just slow down a bit. And like Sarah said, I do think it was important that they followed the rule book. We constantly say in F1, the blurred lines there and whatever, maybe they didn't quite follow the rules and things like that. And I think, as a feeder series, you've got to get into that mindset of, if you do something wrong, there is there's an effect from that. It was heartbreaking, truly heartbreaking to see that. I saw it on Twitter afterwards, and I just thought, that's horrific. But I do place the blame entirely on the team. I just can't believe they didn't say something. I wonder who's having words today. I think something might be said, definitely.
Yeah, I can imagine Toto's had a bit of a word, but I mean, at the end of the day, like, it's pretty clear. Like, we've essentially got 2 Max Verstappen situations, haven't we? Where Dorian Pin looks a class apart. I mean, it's highly impressive. I mean, do you think? I mean, it's obviously, like, I'm going to come to you and Sarah this, but every time we have like a good female driver, like, we sort of say, is this the one that's going to get into F1? But obviously, Dorian Pin's ceiling is very high. She looks above F1 Academy. Like, where do you see her future going? Could she be maybe in the F1 shout, or do you think she'll be like a Jessica Hawkins kind of figure within Mercedes?
I love the work that Jessica does. I think she's a fantastic ambassador for not only Aston Martin, but for the sport in general. But I think it needs to go further than that. I think we need, the goal needs to be for the F1 Academy to slot in somewhere in the feeder series process. They haven't necessarily said where that is. They haven't necessarily said, okay, if you win, you're going to go into F3, you're going to go into F2, I think the route I think needs to be clearer, but that has to be the route, because that was largely where W Series fell down. And I think partially a big part of it is because it wasn't built from within the F1 family, whereas the F1 Academy is. They had Jamie Chadwick, who's obviously this incredible driver, and she was above the rest of the competition there, having won it the 3 years in a row. She's ended up in America. We would have loved to have seen her somewhere closer to home. It's just, they have to make the route clearer. And it's just, that is the only way. That is the only way that it's going to happen, because if you're not competing directly against your peers, you'll never know where you stack against them. It's impossible.
Yeah, you're right. I think last year very much it operated in its own little world, really, didn't it? Like, especially as it was on TV. It wasn't on TV. Sometimes we sort of were guilty for forgetting it was going on. So yeah, I think there's been a lot of improvements this year. Obviously, having the F1 teams involved is great stuff, and also the fact that we can now actually watch it makes it a lot easier. Speaking of, just a quick aside, another Mercedes junior, like obviously Antonelli getting P6 in F2. So another fairly good performance. Like, I think a lot of people were hoping he'd win every race, but obviously F2 is quite hard. So we'll move on back to the F1 race, and obviously have a look around the paddock now. I mean, obviously the big story talking point is Ollie Behrman. So in case you weren't aware of this story, so Carlos Sainz was a bit ill. He missed media day on Wednesday, Thursday, whenever it was. Losing my track because it's on the Saturday. So yeah, missed the media day, which isn't uncommon. We've had a lot of drivers over the years sort of skip out, which is fair enough. I think I would do if I was asked the same question about 20 times in a day. But then he came back for free practice, so we sort of presumed he'd be all right for the race. And then come qualifying, it was announced that he had appendicitis and he was going to miss out. Obviously, not the first F1 driver to have appendicitis. If you remember, a couple of years ago, Alex Albon had his own troubles with his appendix. I mean, his issue was more related to the surgery and complications after that. Of course, misses the race. Nick de Vries comes in, gets a point, and the rest is history kind of thing. But moving back to Carlos Sainz, obviously, he's out. Ollie Behrman steps in. He went from being off on F2 pole to suddenly being in a Ferrari. Alex, what did you make of his race? Because I think everyone was just highly impressed with him.
Oh, yeah, it was really impressive. Ollie, he came in with wide eyes, this bright smile, and he's only 18. And you think, okay, he's great in Formula 2, but Formula 1 is a whole new kettle of fish. But he came in with, again, such maturity. And you could see with each lap he was doing, I mean, first of all, he came in with great pace. But then in the race, each lap he was doing, you could tell that he was just taking bits of information from his lap and he was learning from it. The way he was using the battery, the way he was adjusting the car in comparison to the car in front with the DRS and things like that. And he just put in such a great race. And this is Saudi Arabia. This is Jeddah. This is a dangerous track. He kept it within the lines and he did really well. It's funny. I was looking at the Formula 2 standings and he's right at the bottom, which is hilarious because obviously he had a very difficult weekend. But no, I think it was great, and you could listening to all the drivers, they were almost a little intimidated after the race by how good he did. But I think what was very telling was once he'd gotten out of the car. I mean, first of all, a direct comparison to Nick de Vries. Nick had to have some help getting out of the car for one, and Behrman didn't really show any signs of fatigue at all. I know they come from different sports, but great to see. But the first thing he said was critical of himself. And I thought, wow, that is... maybe it's a British thing. Lando Norris is very similar. He's very self-deprecating in his humour. He's very critical of himself. But he came out and the first thing he said was, I could have got more from the Ferrari. I just thought, wow, if that was me, I'd be like, that was great. End of. That's where I am. But he came out thinking I can do better. And that is such a Formula One way of looking at it. I think he's a real star in the making.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the word that Damon Hill used, in fact. I think it's really interesting. Like, we saw it with Piastri. I mean, we've seen these young guys come into F1 and they're just not looking phased at all, are they? Like, they're absolutely fine where they are. And like you said, that they are so critical. They're so in the mode. I think even on the in-lap after the race, he was sort of having a mini debrief and everyone was like, you've just completed an F1 race. Like, your dad's in the paddock. I mean, as an aside, there's something about dads watching their sons or daughters play sport. It's like, oh my God, I can't take it. And like, just watching him, like the stress embodied on his face. Even when John Elkann came over the Ferrari chairman to try and calm him down, he's like, I can't do it. But yeah, going back to Ollie, like 4 Brits in the top 10 obviously is a great stuff. But I think the most impressive bit, Sarah, was the way he sort of handled himself, especially in the last stint, because obviously he's got Lando Norris, probably a guy he looked up to for the later bit of his career, but also Lewis Hamilton, which is a guy he would have definitely seen when he was a child. Like, how impressive was that stint in particular from him?
Yeah, fantastic. I think, as Alex said, he came in immediately with pace and he wasn't afraid, and he was fairly aggressive, I would say. But it was the racecraft and the patience, and again, I think that circles back to the Formula One mentality. He made that point immediately after, saying I could have done better, and then when he was interviewed by Sky Sports later on, he was like, "Oh, I drained the battery too much in this scenario," and like he's already thinking about that, which is fantastic. And I think it's a really good sign for his future, because I think there are some drivers who get that chance and they're just happy with being quick, but he wasn't. He wanted more out of it than that. I did immediately, and like I was trying to be super positive about it, because I was like, yay, happy F1 news, we haven't had this in so long. But I will just say I really hope that he doesn't go the route of Nick de Vries, that Nick de Vries serves as a cautionary tale, because I think if Ollie Behrman they were talking about him being in a Haas next year, for example, I don't want to see it. I don't like to say it, but I think that's wrong. I don't think that's the right move for him, and I would hate to see him go down that same road, because that was rough. That was very, very rough to watch, and I can't imagine what it felt like to be in Nick de Vries' position. So I really just hope he gets given, I don't know what the alternative is, but I really hope he gets given a better alternative than that. And I think it's awesome that John Elkann was there to witness this, like obviously completely unexpected, but who better to have there on that weekend to see you killing it in a Ferrari? Like that's fantastic for him.
Just drilling down that, like, what is it? Do you think it's a problem of Haas, or is it a problem of timing that you don't want to see him in that car next year?
I just think like the Haas I think Nico Hülkenberg is somehow milking performance out of the Haas. I'm not really sure where he's getting it from. Kevin Magnussen doesn't seem to be able to do the same. I just feel like Haas aren't. I feel like he has too much potential for the team. I feel like he would go there and he would be very frustrated with the lack of performance in the car. Maybe it would be good to keep on building the racecraft, but I think he's got such raw talent in that area already. I would just prefer to see him in a better car, essentially. I think he's got the ability to do that. And, obviously there's all these different relationships up and down the grid, like the Ferrari Haas one is very obvious. Like, does he step out of the Ferrari family and go somewhere else? I don't know, but I think he's got more to offer than what Haas can give him in return. And I think that's sometimes where Formula One careers go to die, is, people show this amazing potential at an early age and then they don't get given the machinery to back it up. And that's really, really hard.
I mean, yeah, I think obviously Mick Schumacher is probably a very good example of that as well.
Exactly.
Like perception is very strong in F1, and like it's pretty much you're judged on your last race. As we saw with Mick, he had a few difficult years at Haas, and he's not been able to get back into F1 since. But as we're speaking about Haas, I mean, this was another major talking point from the race on the weekend, and a lot of very grumpy team principals. I don't know if you were listening on Sky, but James Vowles came over the team radio, just very annoyed at what was essentially a human wall of Kevin Magnussen. Like, if we go through his race, like picks up a 10-second penalty, and then gets another one. So his race is pretty much over, and you're thinking, oh, he'll probably drop down the back of the grid now. And to be fair, it's perfectly legal. It's in the rules, and Haas were very smart, and they essentially said, on a street like Saudi, like people are going to have difficulty overtaking if Magnussen drives well, and he did exactly that. So as we mentioned, McLaren, like Haas also split their strategies, but this time it was Hulkenberg who was on the second stop much later. Magnussen essentially just blocked the rest of the grid. Like between him and I don't know how many spots were sort of caught in his tailwind, and he did a great job, didn't he, Alex? Like it was a real race of two halves, because obviously he had all those penalties, which was not great, and then he essentially got his team and got his teammate a point.
Yeah. I mean, I think I wondered if this would happen under Gunther Steiner. Ayo Komatsu's coming for this year, and he's very process minded. He's very mechanically minded. He's an engineer at heart, and I thought, if Gunther Steiner saw what Magnussen did earlier on in the race, I think he would have thrown his headphones and maybe kind of ducked out and thought, you know what, that's it. But Ayo took a very engineering-minded view of things. And he thought, okay, Kevin Magnussen can't do anything. He's not going to get points. So what else can we do with him? And they utilized him, and Magnussen became, like you said, he became a moving roadblock. And I think, it's helped by the Ferrari hardware that Haas uses. Ferrari is so far up the grid, therefore Haas probably has quite a bit of performance to show as well. But then Magnussen did a really great job. And like Sarah said, I think Hulkenberg, what he's doing with the Haas is just ridiculous. I think he's just squeezing the potential out of that car to the point where I don't know where he's getting it from. It's ridiculous. But Magnussen's a lot more I feel like that's a more realistic view of the car, and the way he used it and the way he was defending, it actually shows that, yes, he didn't have a great day, but his experience really talked. And yeah, like we said at the beginning, it enabled this really interesting kind of bit of racing at the back of the pack, which for me carried a lot of the race. So yeah, Kevin Magnussen, I think he did a really good job. I think he turned a pretty useless place for him in the race around, and he became a real instrument for the team.
So what did you make of there was a lot of complaints, mainly from rival team principals, that this shouldn't be allowed, kind of thing. Like, he's got all these penalties, kind of thing. But I mean, if we look in the history of Formula One, even the recent history, like, this happens all the time. Like, we think back to Alonso Monaco and Alonso again in Hungary. Like, this is exactly fine, isn't it, Sarah? Like, what's your thoughts on that general rule that this is allowed?
Yeah, immediately when you brought this up, I was going to say, this isn't new. And the very first person that came to my head was Fernando Alonso. He's been doing this for years, and no one has, we're all kind of like, you roll the eyes and you're like, oh, Fernando. But this is just how sometimes you have to race dirty, it's not always pretty. It's not always overtaking. It's, you grind the points out however you can. And that's true in every sport. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes it goes down to penalties and it's ugly. Like, I think everything that we saw from Haas was really smart. In this case, it actually did, as Alex said, enable some pretty interesting viewing as well. It was entertaining. It wasn't just like an awful train waiting behind him. Stuff did happen at the same time. It wasn't boring. Obviously, yes, not great for the other teams, but that's sport. I just think that I think they're frustrated, and we know the team principals they're closer to a main character now than they ever have been in Formula One. So I think we just naturally hear from them more. Odds are they've been complaining about this all along when it's been happening in the past and we just didn't hear it. That's my take on it.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, they now have this obviously direct broadcast to Sky, and James Vowles just happened to be this one this weekend. Yeah. I mean, like, it was a perfect situation that, of course, he was going to be annoyed. Albon did eventually pass, but only to P11. I just want to quickly touch on another team that many thought had potential pace, and yet it hasn't really appeared, and that's obviously RB. Like, Yuki Tsunoda in P15, Daniel Ricciardo in P16. Should say Yuki got a penalty much longer after the race. That's why he dropped down a spot. But Alex, what have you made of them so far? Because there was a lot of talk heading into this season that they could be potentially challenging for points, potentially challenging for podiums later down the year. But we just haven't seen that yet, have we?
No, I mean, we came into this season thinking they're going to be taking a lot of Red Bull parts. It might be an RB19 on the grid, and because of that, it's going to show a good level of performance. And Zach Brown, for example, was complaining, saying the relationship between RB and Red Bull is becoming too much. But they've said it's completely within the rules. We're not doing anything wrong. And actually, at the start of the season, we realised that RB aren't using an RB19 clone. It is very much its own design. But it is a shame actually that it hasn't quite gone the way the team wanted it to go. Obviously, they've had an influx of cash. It is kind of a rolling billboard at this point with Visa Cash App and all that kind of stuff, and they are utilizing the relationship with RB with Red Bull, and see, even I'm getting confused with Red Bull, and they are using the reach that Red Bull has as well to bring in some cash. They've moved everything closer to Red Bull as well, so we were really expecting at least kind of top 6, top 5 potential maybe. But no, Yuki and Daniel, they haven't utilized. Maybe it's not necessarily about utilization, but maybe the car just isn't there. And I think Daniel, for one, is very much struggling. He's just not quite clicking with it. When people are quick to judge his driving, when actually it could just be that the car's just not working for him, or maybe it is for Yuki more than him. Like we see with Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez, the car is just more aligned with the way Max drives. But it's a bit of a shame that we're not seeing some really good battles in the midfield. I mean, we've got Mercedes, McLaren, Aston Martin. They are kind of moving about with each other a little bit, but we are getting a very defined grid now. But yeah, I think maybe they could, with the development this season, maybe they might move more towards an RB19. Maybe they've thought, this design hasn't worked. So we could see them develop more into a Red Bull kind of design later on the season, and therefore we might see an almost McLaren jump like they did last season, close to the front of the grid. But yeah, I wonder, when Dmitry Massachusetts passed away, things did change within Red Bull and AlphaTauri. So I do think there's going to be more of a focus on making them a more competitive team and more of a moneymaker as well. So I don't think the story's ended with them right now.
Mm-hmm. And Sarah, just final question. I mean, obviously, this year was billed as a sort of Ricciardo audition for that Red Bull seat. Perez was pretty much written off as he's gone at the end of the year. And yet, the reverse has happened. Perez has done exactly what Red Bull wanted to, 2 P2 finishes. What does Ricciardo... I mean, is Ricciardo already out of this race, or do you think he can sort of put in some more performances and get him into that contention for that Red Bull seat?
I think if I was Checo Perez, I wouldn't be afraid of Daniel Ricciardo right now at all. Like, it was quite stark, actually, the difference between him and Yuki this weekend. I think he qualified like 0.5 off, like half a second off. That's, I mean, I don't know why that happened, but there must be some sort of reason behind it. I think Checo is playing his cards close to his chest. He's playing smart. He's, like you said, he's achieving exactly what the team wants him to achieve. Look, he tried the revolt. He tried the coup. It didn't work. He still has the seat. He's like, okay, I could be under pressure here. How do I stay in Formula One knowing that I am not going to be the star boy of this team? And I think he's doing exactly what he needs to keep that seat. Daniel Ricciardo is pretty much nowhere as far as I'm concerned, and he's in danger really of going back down that road that he was on right before he left and lost his seat, which is like, what is going on with this guy? Where is the driver that we saw years ago? And I just don't know. I don't know what's going on with him right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's another story to keep an eye on throughout the year. But yeah, that would do for today. I mean, obviously, we've got a couple of weeks break now between here in Australia. Back to Sunday, so we can all stop thinking that today is a Monday and get very confused and lose track of our time. So yeah, that's on the 24th of this month. So we'll have a preview, of course, and a review of that race and some podcasts in between. But my thanks again to both of you for joining me today. And yeah, lovely to have you on.
Thanks so much, Sam.
Yeah, thank you. It's lovely to be here.
My thanks again go to both Sarah and Alex for joining me today. I'll put all their info in the description down below so you can follow along with their work. Like I mentioned, we'll be back with a preview for the Australian Grand Prix, but in the meantime, keep checking your feeds for a bonus episode we're going to drop soon. My thanks go to you for listening as well. Make sure you're subscribed, and you can also follow us on social media at Pondering Papaya.